Alright, I was sick and I wanted to make this video about 2 days sooner, but I seem to be getting over it, and so I'll just post this before the month is out. Okay, so there's a relation between IQ and income, and for most of the population, over a large enough population in time, it scales. The squared correlation is around 0.4, meaning the variance in IQ explains about 0.4 of all variance in income, 40%, as far as we can tell. And these relations get higher the more longitudinal it is and the bigger and broader the sample is. This is also why any particular number isn't that important. People say, oh, the real number's higher or lower, because extend the time scale far enough and the relation will tend towards 1. But in any particular year, it's around 0.4 for general variance between individuals, and at least in the 1990s, the median income by racial groups were totally in line with IQ, i.e., a black with an IQ of 90 earned, on average, about as much as a white with an IQ of 90. So I say all this, but then I've also said wealth is luck. And that's not entirely true, but a doctor makes more than a construction worker. Okay, that's understood. When I said wealth is luck rather inartfully, I was talking about Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Michael Bloomberg. Are these people innovative? Okay, well, let's look at Amazon. Was Amazon the first online retailer? No, just go to the Wikipedia page. Now, about as soon as the internet came into existence, in fact, before the internet as we know it came into existence, there were electronic purchases. Individual companies had all sorts of methods for people to electronically purchase products, all using telephone lines, going back to the early 1970s. The first general retailers that I know of, in the UK, there was CFAX, and that started in 1977. This was followed by Oracle and Prestel in 1979. And these were services that had an online catalog that customers could access and purchase stuff on a terminal made for the service, right? So you got the hardware and software were a single thing. You bought it on like the special, on a CFAX terminal. In France, they had service in 1977 called Antiope. In Canada, also in 1977, they had a service called Norpac. In Japan, they developed a similar service called Captain in 1978, and the United States didn't have an online retail service until 1982 with a program called StarText. Telecom Australia was launched in 1985 in Australia and New Zealand. Ireland began adopting the French Mintel system in 1988. These were all hardware-specific services. You had to use a Mintel machine to access the Mintel network. And all these services were classed as a kind of videotex service. So these are the videotex online retail services. And while technically they can be called a kind of internet, in that it was computers talking to each other over a network and traffic was routed all over the place to access servers, it wasn't the internet with the GUI browsers and accessing, public website that Bob made. It wasn't that internet as we know it. In 1994, NetMarket was launched. And that was the first online retailer as we conceive of it on the public internet that you could go through Netscape, for example. And that same year, saw the launch of the Internet Shopping Network. Amazon was founded a year later in 1995. Now, Jeff Bezos didn't invent online commerce. He wasn't the first to market, but maybe he was the best at it. Now, in one sense, he was certainly the best at it in that he got the most sales and eventually became the biggest online retailer, but that doesn't necessarily means he made the quote-unquote best product in some sort of A/B objective testing way. That if you put a person in front of a NetMarket site and that same person in front of the Amazon and ask them to tell you which is better, they may not necessarily pick the they may not necessarily pick the one that has the most market share. A classic example of this is Pepsi and Coke, right? Coke generally outsells Pepsi. However, in taste testing, Pepsi and Coke do about the same.
Pepsi did a taste testing thing which showed that Pepsi was preferred over Coke, but then Coke did another one and showed no, it's actually, and did it with proper methodology and found that no, Pepsi and Coke are about equally, are about equally desired by the public. So but the thing is, Coke has a much bigger market share for reasons that have nothing to do with what we can say through A/B testing is the objective quality of the product. Objective quality of the product being the consumer's subjective valuation of the product through A/B testing. That's how I'm defining objective quality of the product. So the objective quality of the product references a subjective valuation of the consumers, right? But in this sense, the objectively better product doesn't necessarily get higher market share. So, why did people buy from Amazon as opposed to Netmarket or Internet Shopping Network? I don't know for sure. Did Amazon offer a wider selection of products? Did they have a better user interface? I do know that around 2003, 2004, when I was compos mentis enough to think about such things, that nobody I knew even knew about Netmarket, but they all knew about Amazon. So even if Netmarket at that time had a better product, had a better interface, had wider selection, even if Netmarket was better, I and the people I know would never have used it because they had not heard of it. And I was able to find screenshots of Amazon.com and Netmarket from 1998. And they don't look that different to me. Amazon looks a little sleeker and a little bit more modern. But this is the time that Amazon is beginning to pull away. Now look, I'm not saying Amazon wasn't better than Netmarket. Just looking at the sites from screenshots from the Wayback Machine, it looks like Amazon was a nicer looking website at least. But we have to ask ourselves, how much different would a world without Amazon really be? And I think the answer is hardly any different at all. And this goes back to this economic slotting thing I was talking about. In all industries, there's only room for a few companies. And the companies that get the most market share squeeze out the rest. And their existence makes it far more difficult for anyone else to start up and compete. Their presence makes it almost impossible for new firms to pop in unless those firms have serious institutional supports. And an example of this would be Tesla, who's getting money from somewhere. I'm not exactly well read on how Tesla got in. But I think a better example would be the Japanese car companies breaking into the US market. Because what the Japanese government did is they put strict protections, strict tariffs on US cars coming into Japan, right? So that the Japanese car companies could access to all, they could compete against each other, but all the Japanese car companies had a monopoly on the Japanese market for cars, so they could tool up, they could develop themselves and develop the economies of scales, right? And go from an infant industry to a mature industry. Then once they were ready, then they could begin competing with US automobiles. Okay, beginning to export to the US, but in response having to raise the trade barriers to US cars. So, but like regular guys, like if they don't already have a lot of money, and I mean tens of billions, or connections to those who do have a lot of money, can never break into either the automobile market or the online retailer market in a way that would compete with Amazon. Like you can engage in online retail in sort of niche ways, but you're not ever going to be able to replace Amazon. Now, Jeff Bezos ran Amazon out of his garage at the beginning, and I guess he deserves to be a billionaire because he had a more ergonomic website in the 90s. Well, what people deserve is a value judgment, but that's what you're saying. Okay? The thing is, Amazon is profiting from online retail. Amazon didn't create online retail, they took the market share of it. Online retail would have existed with or without Amazon or Alibaba or anyone else. Now you can say that without these companies, the sites might be slightly less ergonomic today. And who knows? Amazon is so radically different
from what it used to be, that extrapolations of it having a better interface then versus Amazon today having a better interface than what NetMarket would have if NetMarket got that market share, who knows? Because it's entirely different people making the modern Amazon site than the people who were making it in the 90s. So there's no way to tell. All right, there's no reason to assume, oh, if it was more ergonomic then, it's going to be more ergonomic 20 years later. It's completely different people running the site at this point. We have no idea if even the better interface Amazon had over NetMarket in the 1990s even meaningfully translates into a better interface than had NetMarket won that contest. Moreover, once a company succeeds in a domain, they then leverage this to gain control over startups and other domains. A classic example is Google. Google tried to get into internet video with Google Video, but was losing to YouTube. And what did they do? They just bought YouTube. Right? So they didn't innovate. Google was able to leverage their search engine dominance to take over email and internet video, and now the Chrome browser. And hold on to your butts when they get into operating systems. The dominant email service today is Gmail. Did Google invent email? Would email not exist without Gmail? There's nothing innovative about Gmail. They're not innovators in this regard. They didn't get their billions by innovating hardly anything at all except for that initial search engine. Okay? So for internet search, was Google that much better than the other search engines back in the time when it was more of a contest? Opinions differ, and maybe Google was better in some objective sense, I don't know. But what we do know is that it became the most popular, in the same way Coke became more popular than Pepsi. That's what we can say with the most objectivity. It became the most popular. Maybe Amazon became popular because people remember the name Amazon. Or maybe Google became popular because people just remember the name. Maybe Amazon became the most popular because it begins with an A, and when people were looking up online retail, one of the first, or maybe the first result that popped up was Amazon because it was the letter A. And so if they were looking through indexes in alphabetical order, Amazon would be the first to pop up and they'd click on it. Maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. So what happens is that there's demand for stuff, and that demand exists largely independent of the action of firms. Firms can discover new demand from time to time, and they can shift it up here and there. And maybe the actions of a firm can cause something like online retail to begin sooner than it would have otherwise. Perhaps online retail could have occurred in, say, 1992 instead of 1994. Maybe the world was ready for online retail as early as 92, and nobody really got around to it until 1994. So firms can do stuff like that. But in the long run, all these things would have happened. We would have had something like Amazon, something like Google Search, something like YouTube, and something like Chrome. Perhaps Firefox would be better if not for the existence of Chrome. And then once they're the dominant player, they can make further improvements in a way that smaller firms just can't match. And so the gap between Google Search and the rest just grows and grows and grows because they have more people using Google Search, so they can refine it off of a larger search population. Okay, and they can employ more big brains to make better algorithms in terms of what people want. Google just has so many more resources that they can just make their search better and better and better in terms of what the potatoes using it actually want. But say Lycos won the search engine wars. Would Lycos today be worse or better than Google? Who knows? Because like with Google Search, the people like in charge of Google Search today are totally different from the people who originally made it. All right. And if Lycos won the search engine wars, the people running Lycos Search would be totally different from the people who originally made it. Right? Let's grant for the sake of argument that Google was objectively better than Lycos back then. That if you did A/B testing, people would say, I prefer the results I'm getting from Google than the results I'm getting from Lycos. I say it was, but we have no idea if Google today would be better than Lycos today if Lycos won the search engine wars. So this is what billionaires do. They take over emerging markets. They don't create the market itself. In none of these instances are the current dominant players the ones who invented any of the things that they're currently dominant in. Google didn't invent internet search or email or internet video or web browsers. In fact, they weren't even able to win in internet video outright, and so they just bought it, leveraging a previous victory, right? Parlaying victories by brute force into dominance in a new market, right? This is not the point of free competition and the best winning out. If it's like taking over a trade node in the game Europa Universalis, right? You didn't create the trade, you just take it. You just take it over. And then you start raking in the cash that comes from dominating that market, which would have existed whether you were there or not. What value does Google actually provide over the counterfactual of Lycos winning the search engine wars? We have no idea. It could be a negative value. Google today could be providing a net negative value compared to the situation where someone else won out, and they would still be making billions. That's important to understand. Any of these, Amazon could be providing a worse product today than if NetMarket won out. I'm not saying they are, but Amazon could be providing a worse product than had NetMarket won out, and they would still be making as much money as they are. And this is the appropriate way to view these companies. The founders of Google aren't even there anymore. Bill Gates isn't involved with Microsoft anymore. The people who currently run these companies are just managing the trade node. No different than if the state had granted them a legal quasi-monopoly at some certain point, and now they're just, parlaying those monopoly effects. Now, to Lolberts, I understand how markets work. I'm not saying that what happened didn't happen, right? People will say, well, Google won out, so they're the best. They got the most market share, right? I'm not saying what happened didn't happen. I'm not saying Microsoft didn't win the operating system war. They obviously did. I'm saying that the money that they're getting, and more importantly, the influence that they have over what you can do, is completely out of proportion to whatever advantage they had over their competitors back when the operating system wars were a competition. If any. That's another thing. Was Microsoft really better than the competing operating systems at the time? That's another, that's a bit of a question mark. So what they're making their billions over, strictly speaking, is becoming the most popular product, which could be because they just chose a name that was easy for people to remember. And everything else is just parlaying that little edge they had when the market was first emerging. Thought experiment. Here's a thought experiment. If Jeff Bezos had to start over and had to compete with Amazon as it currently exists, could he do it? Of course not. Say Bezos, say Bezos, by the hand of God, could create a website that was as good as Amazon today, and had all the supply chains of Amazon. Just poof! God came down and just poofed all these warehouses, all these supply chains into existence that Amazon currently has. God just poofed and duplicated them. Like right next to the Amazon was, Amazon 2 supply, or whatever it's called. Jeff Bezos, market was poofed right next to Amazon. It was completely replicated. And you had all the drivers, you had everything completely replicated. All the warehouses, the shipping agreements, literally everything that Amazon currently has. A complete mirror replication of Amazon in its current mature state was just instantiated immediately. Okay? And if that was handed to them, you handed Jeff Bezos all those advantages, he would still lose. Right? He would still lose because people know about Amazon but wouldn't know about this new company. I'm not saying they wouldn't get any sales, but Amazon already exists. People's habits are with Amazon, and the users are going to continue to use Amazon because that's what they know. And this thought experiment highlights the futility and stupidity of people who just say, oh, well, if you think Amazon is doing something bad, just create an alternative. Just create a competitor to Amazon if you think you can do it better. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, the way the U.S. car market was broken into is that Japan put huge tariffs on U.S. car imports, allowing their own car companies to develop until they were mature enough that they could compete with U.S. car companies in the U.S. It was state protection and state action that was required to break in. Now, Tesla is likewise getting billions from somewhere. I don't know exactly, but I know he's not just some guy going into a bank saying, I want to start a car company. That's not possible. At least not in a major scale. I mean, maybe there you could start like a little community that's insistent on self-sufficiency, and you could create your own car company for that little. You could create like an Amish car company or something. And this is real, and this is the disconnect between the way business schools teach how to make money in business versus how economists operate. Because real businesses have to deal with mature versus infant industries. Right? In economics, they debate this. They say, "Oh, this is a retrograde protectionism arguments or whatever." But in the real world, you have to actually deal with that. You have to actually deal with the asymmetries of all the advantages that these mature industries have. Okay. So Jeff Bezos gets $100 billion or whatever for making a marginally better online retail site than NetMarket in the mid to late 1990s. And that's what it is. Because everything else after that, once Amazon became the dominant player, everything after that was just the march. It was just the march to becoming Amazon of today. Right? And Google made arguably a marginally better search engine than Lycos or Yahoo. Let's grant for the sake of argument that it was a little bit better. Not as better as it is now, but let's just grant for the sake of argument that it was then a little bit better. Okay? Everything after that was just the march. Okay? And more or less preordained. Once Google became the dominant player, everything after that was just the march. And so what you're saying is Google should get billions and their control over email, their control over internet video, their control over web browser. They should have all that because they made a marginally better search engine in the mid to late 90s. Okay? That's what it boils down to in practical terms. So basically what I'm saying is that billionaires didn't create the economy. They just affixed themselves to it and are sucking out profits. They're not 17,000 times more productive than the average Joe. Maybe they do work harder and maybe they're smarter. Okay, fine. Maybe they do legitimately deserve something like 10 times what the average Joe has. But past a certain point, it's not yours. It's not you generating that wealth anymore. Okay? Especially when, in the case of Bill Gates and Bezos, they don't have to lift a finger to do anything in Amazon, and yet all the cash is just piling into their bank accounts and their investment portfolios. At what point do you just say, hey, you're not generating, you're literally sitting on your butt at this point. You're not doing anything that generates wealth. And in fact, long ago, Amazon continued to grow while you did nothing. And they grew from that, and they grew off of the labor of people being paid $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year. People who were being paid their real calibrated market value of their labor. And so what you're looking at with these billionaires is outsized wealth. You're looking at wealth that's pooling in them that is disconnected from the traditional supply and demand market for labor. All right. Jeff Bezos isn't providing hardly anything of value, but he has affixed himself to this thing, Amazon, that had market dominance and is then just cutting off the top, making money off of the work of the people who work for Amazon at this point. Okay, that's what's actually happening. Why? Well, because he made a nicer interface in the mid to late 90s. Right? That's and in practical terms, that's what you have to say, and you have to say this is okay. Now, there was a paper, Talent versus Luck, the role of randomness in success and failure. And they ran a simulation, and I'll talk about that, okay? But let me just describe it for now, before giving my thoughts on it. They ran a simulation which had individuals with varying degrees of talent. They all had basically loaded dice rolls, with more talented people having the dice loaded biased more towards success than failure, or lucky versus unlucky events. So for any given event, a highly talented person
may have a 60% chance of success, while a less talented person may have a 40% chance of success. So it was a series of loaded dice rolls. And they ran several simulations here with unequal starting capital, with equal starting capital, increased or decreased the severity and or incidence of lucky and unlucky events. And they also had people connected to others in random ways, so that success of someone proximate to you would somewhat transfer to you, right? Sort of the personal network effects. And the effects of successes in these simulations are multiplicative, because as you get more money, you can invest more, parlaying one success into more successes. But failures operate more linearly, not entirely linearly, as the more money you have, the more money you can lose. But since the payoff from success is generally higher than the cost of failure, which is vindicated by the fact that the stock market has grown by an average of 10% a year over the past 20 years, this isn't an unrealistic assumption, meaning that wealth tends to snowball, whereas losses tend to be less snowbally. They tend to be more linear, though not completely linear. And so what they found was that there was some relation between success and talent. It wasn't zero, right? But they tested a range of values, and they all produced some variation of a slightly right-shifted distribution of final capital. But in all instances, the richest people had a talent level only slightly above the mean. So as a population, based on the simulation, we would assume billionaires have an average IQ of around 110 to 115. Okay? Much lower than doctors or engineers. And so the folksy bias that the richest are not necessarily the best and brightest is borne out by this simulation. Now, with simulations, of course, you got to be careful, because I could come up with a simulation that says God just came in, handed out all the wealth, and handed it out in a way that precisely matches the way wealth is currently distributed, and then say that this is evidence that God made things the way they are. Why? Because look, the world totally matches the results of my simulation. My simulation says God comes down and hands out wealth in exactly the way it's currently distributed. Well, there you go. My simulation, is evidence that God did all this, right? So I'm not saying this paper for sure accurately reflects the real world, but the simulation explains what we see better than, say, any metric that solely relies on talent or intelligence explaining the disparities. And their assumptions in creating the model were certainly more sophisticated than God did it. And it was, and they go through it, and it's based on research of class lucky and unlucky events, and how much these events are empirically shown to impact wealth of people in the real world. So it's not, so the goes-intos of the simulation are research. They're not just made up. They're not just, hey, let's try this, let's just keep trying things until we get a result that matches the real world. What they did, they started out with a whole bunch of empirically based assumptions, and then they ran, I forget how many they ran, at least 20 simulations, and they all matched the real world's distribution of wealth fairly well. And what I think needs to be done is an analysis that includes insized and outsized wealth, because IQ is a good predictor of income that you're going to earn in a career over time with a sufficiently large population. When you're comparing the wage incomes of populations in tens of millions, it becomes very effective, though that effect is weak. That effect, I think, is currently weakening and is going to continue to weaken as you get something where, for example, Indian Americans, they develop financial networks that whites are legally prohibited from forming because, segregation, anti-discrimination laws, right, which functionally only apply to whites. Okay, so, but it really begins to fail once you get into wealth generated by investment or starting a business, because that wealth becomes dictated more by the general economy around you. And you can become wealthy if a bunch of people in an area just know about you and don't know about the guy you're competing with. And wealth begins to pool into you for reasons completely unrelated to anything that you're actually doing. this, okay, I'll go with this. I'll go with this. I don't know. You know what? Screw it. I'll just go with this. Think about James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd on YouTube. He started making fun of bad video games in front of his friends, and his friends loved it. And they told him that he should post these videos on the internet. And he was sort of going back and forth whether he should do so. Now, we now know that was obviously a great decision for him. What if one of his friends at the time was particularly persuasive and convinced James Rolfe not to do that, not to post his videos on the internet, and instead just focus on his traditional career, focus on going to college, learning something, and getting a traditional career? Well, that sort of chance event, right? What we classify as a chance event, now, world is ultimately as deterministic as the behaviors of atoms and even perhaps subatomic particles, but you know what I mean by chance event. That kind of chance event would mean we don't have the angry video game nerd. And maybe instead, someone like the irate gamer would have been the first big user into that niche of content, and he'd be the big name and would be accused of being a ripoff of AVGN. And you'd say that would be a terrible world, because AVGN is better than irate gamer, but then AVGN might come along later after seeing the success of irate gamer and be accused of being trying to irritate and rip off the irate gamer. Now, is James Rolfe 100 times better than the irate gamer? Okay, all irate gamer jokes aside, honestly, no, he's not 100 times better. Maybe he's 5 times better. But James Rolfe is definitely earning more than 5 times what the irate gamer earns. And this is outsized wealth. James had an earlier start, makes a better product, I would say so. But then the knowledge of that better product gets more well-known, more people come to see him, and so despite only having 5 times a better product than the irate gamer, he gets something like 100 times the audience. When you have people making physical objects like growing crops, pumping oil, blacksmithing, yes, the smarter guy will generally be the better blacksmith, but whatever that disparity is bounded by the limited biological variation in Homo sapiens and what he can physically do with his hands. And yes, I'm a hereditarian and recognize big genetic differences between people. In fact, far larger than the average Joe imagines exists in terms of variation between people and populations. But it's not thousands of times different. Average people aren't cockroaches compared to billionaires. Companies today, it's interesting, because companies today are trying to ape the practices of more successful companies, and it almost never works. It's all just like a big cargo cult. That companies are doing this, and they're more successful. Like, that company's doing this, they're more successful. Let's do that too, and we'll be successful like them. And what ends up happening is it doesn't work, because the reason some other company is doing better may just be because they have more name recognition, or just by chance, word of mouth, people got out to buy a product that you make, but then they conflated the name of that product with the name of the company. For example, I'm going to go out and buy a Coke, or I'm going to go buy a Nintendo tape, or I'm going to go Google something, right? So the service, yeah, right, the general service is then conflated with the proper noun of the company. Now, once some lucky guy latches onto a market node and diverts wealth of the economy into himself and his firm, now he has wealth functionally disconnected from, market exchange. Because for now, at least, Microsoft, for example, doesn't have any real competition in operating systems. Yeah, Linux, OS, but those are relatively quarantined and gate kept. Like, they just make money selling operating systems and your data. This gives Bill Gates passive income, i.e. money made from the work of others that he just gets. And so Bill Gates can now operate like a mini state, right? Now, states get their money from people through taxation, and that's a kind of passive income that's given to the state.
Now, traditionally, because of this state, because states get all this passive income, states are highly regulated and very prescribed in what they can and can't do. Billionaires are much less regulated, and so billionaires act as mini states, or sometimes not so mini states, as the annual income of some private individuals is often higher than that of certain African countries. But take a small state like Luxembourg. Maybe its total tax revenue is higher than what Jeff Bezos makes in a year. I don't know. It's not that important. Let's say it is. Probably is. But Luxembourg has to spend that money on things like roads, schools, water treatment, medical care, right? The government of Luxembourg is very prescribed in what they can spend that money on. Bezos, however, say he gets $5 billion a year, he can spend that on whatever he wants, with some exceptions. He can't buy nuclear weapons or Apache helicopters or whatever, but he's not constrained in the same way that a state is. There's some things that the state gets to spend money on that private billionaires can't, but by and large, the private billionaire is much more free in what he can spend the money on. He doesn't have to put that money into medical services for other people or anything else. He can put it into some media outfit and push his retarded opinions that he has. Right? And people can go, oh, but you're really smart because you're a billionaire, right? No, I just made a slightly more ergonomic online retail site in the late 90s and then benefited from the march after that. Or he can just throw it away in Africa aid so that some warlord can buy more guns and drugs while Bezos feels good about himself, right? That's what these people like to do. They like to take resources generated from you and then give it to African warlords, right? To more secure their power in Africa. So basically these billionaires, they have little swords of states, and they got it by sucking off surplus value. Now, if you want to say, oh, I don't like you using the word surplus, that's a Marxist word. Well, okay, but like, that's what it is. There is a surplus from Amazon. That's value, and it's going to Jeff Bezos. And how is that value generated? It's generated by the people working for Amazon. So sorry if you don't like it because of the Marxist terminology, but it's literally true, okay? Now, the state sucks up surplus value through taxation, all right? These billionaires do it by market control. Market control that is thousands of times out of proportion to whatever, if any, initial objective superiority of the product that they were selling during the competitive phase of that emerging market. This outsized wealth creates archons. Okay, people with wealth that they can wield like a sword because it's not connected to any particular thing that they have to do. It is disconnected from market discipline, right? So they are archons. And one humorous example of an archon is Mike Bloomberg and what he's doing with the Democrat Party. Now, I think it's funny because Bloomberg is screwing over the Democrat Party, trying to block Bernie Sanders, who any political analyst with an IQ above room temperature knows the Democrats must run. They know that they must run Bernie Sanders. Even if they were to lose to Trump in a landslide by running Sanders, which I don't think is a foregone conclusion. There's a lot of boomers say, oh, he's a communist, he'll certainly lose. Sorry, we got all Ronald Reagan's natural conservatives all up in here, so it's much more likely that Sanders could win. But for the sake of argument, let's say that's the case. Even if they would certainly lose in a landslide to Trump, the Democrats must run Bernie in order to keep their party from splitting. They could say, look, we ran the quote-unquote radical, he got blown out. So, and that would placate the radicals and also chide them a little bit within their own party, right? Or the perceived radicals, right? But see, Bloomberg probably has an IQ, 115, 120. He's a high midwit. He's smarter than the typical midwit, but he's like a high midwit. But he's got billions because he had lucky events happen in his life, and he was just smart enough to capitalize on the lucky events. So his high midwit take that the Democrats must run a moderate, or at least what passes for a moderate these days, in order to beat Trump, that's becoming the policy of the DNC because Bloomberg's got the bucks to control the DNC. So now the DNC is being retarded because Bloomberg is politically retarded. Now, right? And so it's funny, people are talking about, oh, Russian interference in U.S. elections, that's bad because that's a foreign state interfering in elections, but that's what Bloomberg is doing. Bloomberg, having his outsized wealth, he's now functionally an archon. He is functionally a mini-state in terms of being able to wield wealth around the world in a way disconnected from market discipline, okay? And so Bloomberg is functionally a foreign government intervening in this election. Now, in this instance, it's not particularly bad because what he's doing is just beclowning himself and screwing over the Democrat Party. But it's, you know, so I don't mind Bloomberg being a dumb billionaire archon screwing up the DNC. But there's examples where this is really bad. Google, for example, paid off the Heritage Foundation to write articles against government regulation of Google. Okay, that is a far more dangerous and evil behavior. Bloomberg's actions are more comical, but they still show the dangers of billionaire archons. Google's behavior is actually doing harm to society, right? They're destroying free thought because now, to write at the Heritage Foundation, you know, if Heritage Foundation wants their Google bucks to keep flowing, they have to write articles favorable to Google's abuses, covering up for Google's abuses, right? Specific policy proposals get complicated, and I don't know what a theoretical state should do. I have some half-formed ideas, but I know for sure that I mean, no good policy is going to come from the U.S. government as it currently exists. So it's not really, you know, talking about specific policy proposals is not that meaningful in the United States today because the United States federal government can't do anything good because it's so rotten to the core. So it's not really an interesting discussion. Oh, well, the U.S. government could do this and this, and this would be good. This would be good. This would be good. Sure, but any talk about state policy is at this point theoretical. You know, for one day far off over the rainbow where we get an actual functional government, in all likelihood through secession. Right? That's what talks about policy really should revolve around. As for what's going to be done within the U.S., who knows? Who cares? The U.S. is a dump, right? And by a dump, I mean, like a home is defined by exclusion. Okay? If you can't exclude people from your home, then it's not a home. It's a common space, and anybody can come in and anybody can just dump whatever. Okay? So in order to have a homeland must have exclusion. Right? You must be able to exclude other types of people from entering your homeland. Otherwise, it's not a homeland, it's just a land. And so when someone says, let's let everybody in, what they're saying is, let's destroy your home. Let's convert your home into a common. And what happens with commons? They become a dump, right? That's what happens to commons. Commons become dumps. So, and that's what the United States is today. It's just a dump. In a definitional sense. Not just in that it's like a bad place to live. 'Cause in the global scheme of things, it's not a particularly bad place to live, but definitionally, in terms of being open to anyone, largely, it's a dump, right? People can just dump on in. But anyway, even though I can't really propose any specific policy proposals, at the very least, we need to change our attitudes towards individuals and organizations with a lot of money. They almost never got it by innovating. Right? Their wealth is not a function of them actually being that much better at what they do or actually providing that level of value. They were more popular when the markets first formed. Then they parlayed and multiplied that edge in market share, not even necessarily in delivering a superior product. I mean, if we had to guess, we guess their products were somewhat superior, right? But not necessarily. And they parlayed that edge to just dominate entire sectors of the economy to the point where they have a functionally passive income because they're making money off of a societal function from an economic slot that they took over that would exist with or without them, and that they didn't create that economic slot. Now, the people who work at Amazon created Amazon, but Jeff Bezos didn't create Amazon past, I don't know when he stopped really being involved in it. And even when he was involved in it, he's just, the CEO. He's not creating everything, right? And as a CEO, yeah, certainly he deserves some money. He deserves, probably more than anyone who works at Amazon, okay? But the wealth that's going to Bezos is not a product of actual exchange, right? It's a product of Amazon's market dominance. Whereas the wages of the people who work at Amazon, it's part of a wage negotiation between Amazon and the people who work for Amazon, right? So their wages, the wages of the people who work at Amazon, that's disciplined by market exchange. Jeff Bezos's wealth, he's not exchanging with anyone. He just owns Amazon. Amazon turns a profit. He takes that off the top, right? There's no market exchange. There's not the two lines that intersect, and that's where the wage is for Jeff Bezos. No, it's his wealth is completely divorced from any kind of traditional economic calculation. It's outsized, and he becomes an archon, right? Our attitude towards billionaires needs to be that maybe 1% of their wealth is truly earned and deserved, and 99% of it is just, well, I think theft of everyone's surplus value. Now, that word is rubs some people the wrong ways. What exactly is theft? Isn't theft? Certainly it's legal. Okay, maybe if you don't like the word theft, pretend I didn't say theft and I said some other word. Okay, but what they're doing is they're monopolizing societal functions. And we need to have the attitude that the money that's currently in Jeff Bezos's bank accounts is not really his. Okay, and we should seek to take it away from him. We need to have the attitude that, yes, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, that's not your money, and we seek to take it away from you. We seek to take Facebook, Amazon, and Windows away from you and make it a societal function bound by U.S. constitutional law and freedom of speech. Because when Bezos can decide what gets sold on Amazon, to an extent, he's deciding what can get sold online. When Zuckerberg decides what you can say on Facebook, he is partly saying what you can say on the internet itself. And say you have, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, if they all have similarities in what you're allowed to say on those platforms, that's basically like 90% of the internet in terms of expressing opinions. The opinion expressing internet, that's like 90% of it, right? So they're basically deciding what you can say on the internet. Now, so that's not a position he earned. That's not a position he deserves. The social network, something like Facebook, is a societal function that would exist with or without Zuckerberg and Facebook itself. And they need to be brought to heel somehow. And it's this change in attitude that is needed as a first step to any counter to what these people are doing. We need to put down the Lolbert. We need to recognize what is actually happening. We need to recognize the reality of infant industries versus mature industries. We need to recognize the reality of network effects and censorship and how current players can prevent the entry of other players into a market. Right? We have to deal with the expression of power in the real world and just move past, put down the Lolbert ducky, right? If you want to begin to fight back.